Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Perligo Ponders, in which I respond to your comments, questions, and theories related to my own comments, questions, and theories about the lore and music of 21 Pilots. As always, if you'd like your comment to be featured in the next episode, simply comment something interesting down below, a question you have or a theory you have. Feel free to flag it as a question for Perligo Ponders if you would like, so it catches my eye, but I don't exclusively pull comments with that tag. Now, this is the first episode of Perligo Ponders in 2026, and after about a month's break between episodes, there are a good number of questions and comments to catch up on. So, without further ado, let's get started. This first comment comes from a Spotify listener named Eustace, or Justice. In Stressed Out, he says that his name's Blurryface, but then in I Am Clancy, we hear that Nico calls himself Blurryface. So, is Nico singing Stressed Out? Also in Leave the City, is Tyler leaving the Banditos to perform out on the submarine on Saturday, or is Leave the City about something else? So obviously there are two questions here. Tackling the first, I think in short, yes. Nico is singing Stressed Out. Nico and Blurryface are one and the same, and the album Blurryface I've always seen as a character study of the character Blurryface, or Nico. Just like Clancy is a character study of Clancy. It's the album called Clancy, and it's all about Clancy, that version of Tyler, the Clancy version of Tyler. Blurryface is all about Blurryface, or that version, the Nico Blurryface version of Tyler. Stressed Out, in a way, introduces that character and explains that in this album, his name is Blurryface, and the album is from the perspective of Blurryface. And this is also why the song Stressed Out is associated with Nico. The 9 bishops of Dema all have their names derived from lyrics from songs on Blurryface, except for Nico. There are no lyrics or parts of lyrics that can be taken to spell out Nico or Nicholas Bourbaki or anything like that. So the song he's associated with is Stressed Out, and certainly that's the circle on the Blurryface album cover that corresponds to the Tower of Nico and so on. There are a good number of connections which associate Nico to Stressed Out, and it is in that song that he calls himself Blurryface. So yes, in short, yes. Nico is the one singing Stressed Out. And in a sense, you can consider the album Blurryface to almost be a prequel album to the Trench saga. Just like Heavy Dirty Soul as a music video is something that I consider almost to be a prequel to the music video saga that really starts with Jumpsuit, but has a prequel in Heavy Dirty Soul. The album Blurryface as a whole is sort of a preamble to the main core of the story and introduces, okay, there's this character, Blurryface. Let's take a look at him. And here's the story that he fits into after that. To your second question, in Leave the City, is Tyler leaving the Banditos to perform on the submarine on Saturday, or is Leave the City about something else? So Leave the City is in case you don't know, is the final track on Trench, track 14, and it came out, or obviously Trench came out, and so that track accompanying it came out before Skilled and Icy and Saturday and anything like that. There are some theories, I don't know if I believe these or not, which is not to say I don't believe them, I'm completely taking a neutral stance on them. There are some theories that everything that was going to happen in Skilled and Icy, the propaganda tour and all of that, was not thought of until about 2020. And so that was a new direction the story took in 2020. But when Trench was written, they were not intending for the propaganda tour, for the submarine, all of that kind of stuff to take place. Skilled and Icy really was a product of 2020, and Clancy and Breach, what we see in those stories is probably a closer follow-up, or probably would have been a closer follow-up to Trench if 2020 hadn't happened the way it did. Again, I don't know how I feel about that theory. I'm perfectly willing to believe it, but I also am not fully convinced of it. I'm neutral on it, but it is an interesting sort of context to this. But even leaving that aside, just an answer purely to what the song is about, I don't think Leave the City is about performing on the submarine. He wouldn't be leaving the Banditos because, like, the city obviously is referring to Dema, and the Banditos aren't in Dema. So by leaving the city, he would be leaving to go find the Banditos. You know, the lyric, "In time I will leave the city, for now I will stay alive," implies he has a choice, and he's choosing to stay within Dema. In the Saturday submarine context, he didn't have a choice. He was forced by the bishops to go and perform on the submarine. He wasn't deciding to go or not go. And certainly we see that he did go. So the idea of him not leaving the city now, in time I will, but for now I'm going to stay here and stay alive, wouldn't really make sense alongside that. So I can understand why, kind of off the title and things like that, and a surface level understanding of Leave the City, you might see that fitting into the context of going to perform outside the city. But just given how the story played out, I don't think there's any way that lines up. but good question. Next up, we have a comment from Rob Deltoni. Apologies if I butchered the pronunciation there. Rob writes, for Perligo Ponders, I had a bittersweet epiphany surrounding city walls and the end of the lore, and surprisingly, it connects to Isle of Flightless Birds from Self-Titled. Isle of Flightless Birds ends with the question of which side, good and evil, the listener is going to pick. And if Clancy and Blurryface are more so titles than names for a person, combined with the fact that the cycle begins again with the Nova Bishop in charge, I think speculation on whether the next cycle will be the one to break it is misguided. Interesting. The point isn't for one side to win and the other to lose, and as others have pointed out, it makes sense for a metaphor about mental health. The point is to pick which title you want to live up to. Do you pick despair and destruction by taking on the title of Blurryface, or do you pick hope, perseverance, and creativity by taking on the title of Clancy? By looking at the lore through the lens of Isle of Flightless Birds, it gives the story more meaning and purpose and makes more sense than fanfics on how the cycle could be broken in the future. Hopefully I explained that well, and I would love to know your thoughts on the theory. That's a good idea, and I think it's a good point. I will push back on a little bit, and correct me if I'm misunderstanding your point and your theory here, but basically, in short, the idea is that the ending of the story is reminiscent of the ending of the self-titled album with Isle of Flightless Birds. It's not showing you a particular ending, it's saying, here are two endings, here are two, or maybe two endings is the wrong terminology to use, but here are two figures, right? Here are two symbols. There's Clancy and Blurryface. And it's time for you, the listener and the viewer, the audience, to pick which side you want to go with. And so it kind of allows the creators, 21 Pilots, to step back from sort of, I suppose, moralizing on the ending and just saying, here are these things, you decide as an audience. Now, there is some benefit to that, and certainly that is a theme that we see played throughout their music, as you pointed out in Isle of Flightless Birds. And I do agree there are plenty of parallels between Isle of Flightless Birds and the ending of the story. There are a number of parallels between the self-titled album and the entire story, as I made a video on in the past. But Isle of Flightless Birds in particular, even from the start of Paladin Strait, has had a number of parallels and been a really interesting sort of metaphor for what we see at the end. So it's perfectly valid to draw comparisons to that and pull out meaning from that. The way I would push back, though, is I think at the end of the story, we do see Tyler make a choice. He chooses to become a new bishop. Now, you can theorize about, how much choice did he really have in that moment? Who is he really? Sure, we can have those conversations, and I think they're valid and interesting conversations to have. Like, is he really Nico in that moment, or is Clancy somewhere else, and Nico is there now, and he's entered, the spirit of Nico has entered that body, and the spirit of Clancy is somewhere else now? That could be true. But regardless, we see the main character take on the mantle of a bishop and essentially go over to the darkness that he's been fighting against the entire time. That's what you see as the surface level story. And so I think it is valid to say, okay, there's probably something more here, especially with the release of Dragpath. And I think, in a sense, you might acknowledge that there is something more to it, because something more is implied at the ending when Josh, the torchbearer, says, Clancy is still out there. We need to go find him. You know, the idea of there being two symbols at the end and choosing which one to go with implies that there's more to the story, because we don't see Clancy at the end. Clancy's gone. He's become Nico, and apparently there's a new Clancy starting his own cycle out there. So which one are you going to go with? Well, going with Clancy implies that there is more to the story. I agree we shouldn't necessarily create some kind of fanfic and imply that this is canonical to the lore. But I don't think we need to. I think the story is actually there in front of us. I don't think we need to create a fanfic, as it were, to tell the final ending of the story or the future ending of the story. I think that's laid out for us very explicitly in Dragpath. And when I say I think, I believe you can lay out the evidence for it in a very strong argument. And I do this in one of my videos about Dragpath. But certainly with lyrics like, now the sun begins to rise, we made it through the darkest night, you found me. Which is completely contrary to the ending that we actually see, in which the sun begins to rise and he doesn't find him in time. The torchbearer doesn't get into the room in time. He becomes a bishop, right? The hope is gone at the end of City Walls when he turns over to the bishops, but the hope is very much there at the end of Dragpath. All that is to say, I don't disagree with the sentiment that Clancy and Blurryface, being two different sides of Tyler, are both held up as symbols of two very opposing things, and it is a sentiment throughout the music and the story of 21 Pilots that you need to pick which side you're going to go with. I just don't think that Clancy picking to go or Tyler, the figure of Tyler, the character Tyler plays, choosing to go with the side of darkness at the end is the ultimate ending. And again, I think they make that very clear. That isn't sort of blindly optimistic cope on my part when watching the music video of City Walls and wishing it turned out differently. That's me saying they gave us a different ending. So hopefully that makes sense. Definitely feel free to push back against this pushback that I gave in the comments. I'd be happy to kind of interact with this idea further, because I do think there's a lot of validity to what you were saying. I just think parts of it I definitely disagree with. But let me know if you have some counter arguments to my counter arguments. I'd be curious to continue this conversation in the next episode or the one after, whenever you get around to responding. And all in all, thank you for your comment. That's a very interesting point that you bring up. Next up, we have a comment from Cade Uchiha. Again, apologies if I butchered that. Perligo ponders. So we know that before City Walls, the other bishops can use seizing. However, in City Walls, as far as we know, Clancy is the only one who gets that power. So how do you think the other bishops got seizing for the upcoming cycle? I assume by the other bishops mean the banditos who became bishops. The fact that the other bishops don't have seizing, unless they somehow got it later, makes me think this cycle might be different, in the sense that Clancy will break the next cycle as the Nova Bishop. In other words, destroying dema and vialism from the inside. This is an interesting comment. It sort of plays off of the last one that we were looking at. And this is an interesting part of the story that I hadn't thought of. When the banditos become bishops, what does that mean for them? What powers come along with that just by accepting the cloak and mantle that Clancy hands them as the Nova Bishop? Because he obviously has a lot of the abilities that the bishops had, and that was sort of the point why he was the exception to the rule, but the banditos didn't. And so yeah, what's going on there? Do the robes themselves sort of convey some sort of power, or is Clancy able to teach them the power of psychokinesis now that they're able to wield it from within the Towers of Dema, right? Is there some special ability associated with that? There could be a lot of different ways to interpret that. My inclination would be to assume that they do eventually or immediately get all of those powers. I think the ending that we see is sort of supposed to be a representation of something that's been going on, right? It's emphasized time and again throughout the story that this is a cycle. And so there's an implication that several times before, a similar thing has taken place where the current ranks of bishops are replaced by new bishops. Clancy, by failing, becomes blurryface time and again. And it's just like, this is the final time that they've gotten this far, but this isn't necessarily the first time that something like this has happened. I mean, I don't know. I think you could make some counter arguments to that. I think there are different ways to look at it based off the lyricism and City Walls and the letters and so on. But, I wouldn't be surprised if something like this has happened before. And certainly the original bishops hijacked the religion and sort of took it over from something else and gained that power themselves. So I think however it plays out in the world and the lore, I think there definitely is a sentiment and an idea that this is something a power which you can learn once you are a bishop. Even if it's hard and rare to be someone who learns it as a citizen or a bandito, like Clancy. Again, he was an exception for a reason. But I think once you become a bishop, either those powers are conveyed or it's taught to you in a way that couldn't be taught to you otherwise. Something like that. To the idea of destroying vialism from the inside. Again, I don't know how much indication we get that that's happening, but I wouldn't rule it out. I think there's every reason to believe that could be something that's happening. I just think the ending that we are shown, what's going to happen next, is more that this Nova Bishop, this final Clancy becoming a Nova Bishop, laid the groundwork for the next Clancy to succeed. And so rather than him, the Nova Bishop, taking down vialism from inside, I think he has fully succumbed to vialism and blurryface on that side of him. But knowing that this was going to happen, and in this final attempt, he laid the groundwork, he laid out all the evidence for the final Clancy to come in and win. And vialism would still be defeated from the outside. So in a sense, he's defeated vialism from the inside because he's on the side of the one to defeat him, but he himself is not doing the work from inside to defeat vialism. And some have theorized, so I won't take credit for this theory, but some have theorized that this has kind of been a reoccurring thing, that each version, or at least the past version of Blurryface, of Nicolas Bourbaki, had been a Clancy in the past, and wanted this Clancy to succeed as well, but knew he was going to lose. And that's why there are these moments, like in Paladin Strait, right? The moment that was first introduced to us in Paladin Strait, and again got repeated in the contract in City Walls. But this moment where he puts his hands on Clancy's neck and talks to him, so few, so proud, so emotional, hello Clancy. There's almost a sadness and a sorrow in his eyes, or so the theory goes. And so he wanted this Clancy to succeed, and he knows in that moment he's not going to. There's a sadness within him that this other part of him, right? If we take a step back, this other side of Tyler wasn't able to break free. I don't know. It all gets a bit complicated and convoluted, but I think there is sort of that metaphor within it as well. All right, this next comment comes from someone on Spotify who has commented before, but wishes to remain anonymous. The spirit of rebelling is my name for Clancy's role in the Banditos and seizability. Maybe not to the next person to find him, but someone. But it's like the addiction cycle. Escape and a fast push, nearly get pulled back over and over, but escape finally, then fall back, trying to completely escape the addiction or help someone and start again. But it's always like someone else, the devil or Nico, is doing it, as you never really want to do whatever it is. Yeah, and I think this is an interesting thought coming on the heels of Clancy, because there definitely were elements to that album which sort of implied a struggle with addiction. Now, that can mean a number of different things. It's not for us to speculate what addiction meant in Tyler's instance or anything like that. But regardless, I think there definitely are themes similar to this playing throughout the story. And the idea of really trying to break free from something again and again, and feeling like it's out of your control, out of your hands. And this is something that, again, this is something that's an element to addiction, but also an element to struggles with mental health and depression, right? The sort of sense that this overwhelming weight of sorrow and despair, let's say, is being imposed on you by something else because you don't fully understand why it is that you feel that way. And so that's part of the reason that I see for Tyler creating a character like Blurryface, giving that seemingly external force that's bringing this darkness and struggle into his life a name and a seat at the table so that he can then come face to face with it and confront it. And so, like you said, the devil / Nico, right? This power, this force for darkness exists in the struggle within Clancy's mind, being this kind of reoccurring theme that you're constantly trying to fight against, but even when you think you might have fully escaped, or you might be fully breaking free or defeating it, like in City Walls, right at the last minute you get pulled back again and you have to start all over. Or the farther you rise up from it, the farther you have to fall back. So great point overall. I don't have a ton more to expand upon it other than I mainly wanted to include it here because I think it's a really good explanation and analysis of what's going on here. Here we have another comment from Eustace. I hope you're pronouncing your name correctly. Spotify user again. Do you believe that all the songs in Blurryface, Trench, Skeleton Icy, Clancy, and Breach are part of the lore? Or do you think that some songs aren't related to the lore? In short, the second part of this is correct. I don't think that all the songs, I think some songs aren't related to the lore. I don't think all the songs are related to the lore. And okay, there is a caveat to that, especially with Blurryface and Clancy, where the lines between the lore and real life, the real world, blur together quite a lot. And certainly with songs that play into these character studies of Blurryface or Clancy, for instance, there's a lot of room for those to overlap between real life and the story. Now, I think there are definitely songs which you can identify as lore songs, and then there are other songs where you're like, this is not really related to the lore. But again, I think because the lore is about real people, Tyler and Josh, what it is that they're struggling with, and specifically what Tyler's struggling with as a human being, is what's being described in the lore. So certain songs that don't necessarily have name drops or lore discussions or something like that could still relate to the lore in the sense that they're still describing this person who's depicted in the lore, if that makes sense. In a sort of broad general sense, I still wouldn't say all the songs on those albums are part of the lore, but I would say most of them could probably be seen to relate to that story, generally speaking, because that story, generally speaking, is an extended metaphor for mental health, and specifically Tyler's mental health, which most of their music is about. But I do think there are very specific songs which are lore related, and I think in the past they've even said in interviews, not all the songs on these albums are lore songs. They also don't want the songs to have to be viewed through the lens of the lore. That's just an added element for those of us who are interested in the lore. And to that point, I think I made a video on this like a year or two, maybe even 2 years ago. That's crazy. Discussing how while not all the songs play into the lore, I think all the songs do play into the real world. So it isn't really that there are real world songs and lore songs. All the songs have a meaning in the real world, but some of them also have this sort of lore element that means something different in the context of the lore. And the number of songs that I see as lore related, or most people do, varies from album to album. And I think the lines are the most blurred in Blurryface. No pun intended, right? But again, because that's sort of a character study introducing us to this character of Blurryface, and the lore wasn't fully developed, there are things like, the song Doubt, for instance, name drops bishops. So we can see, okay, Doubt is a song which relates to the lore because of that. But then Heavy Dirty Soul doesn't name drop bishops or anything like that, but obviously has a music video that's part of the lore. Stressed Out says, my name's Blurryface. Blurryface is a character in the lore as, placed into canon, and I am Clancy, and so on. So I could do it. If you're interested, let me know, and I will do this. So I could do a video going through and kind of identifying which songs clearly relate to the lore in that sort of clearer sense, as much as you're able to do that, and then which ones don't really tie in explicitly to the lore. So just for example, Heavy Dirty Soul, Stressed Out, and Doubt off of Blurryface would be an example of 3 songs on that album that relate to the lore that I would list as relating to the lore, but there are more. Goner, for instance, is as well. So let me know. I can do that if that would be a helpful kind of explanation and breakdown for people to have. And that would in some ways tie into my interpretation of this. I think some people, again, especially with Blurryface, there may be some wiggle room to disagree on that and push back. And I think some people probably would. But in my mind, I think it's generally quite clear which ones are lore songs. Finally, the last comment for today's episode comes from Abby Weiss, who is a longtime frequent contributor to these episodes. So it's great to see you, Abby, once again. For Perligo Ponders, the empty set means most simply that there's no solution for the given equation or inequation. I wonder if this told us exactly where the story would go even from the beginning, or at the very least that there is no true solution, only growing and going through the cycle and trying to do better. Edit, I also wonder if we learned the end of the Dema storyline in A Car, A Torch, A Death from the lyrics. He laid it out what he had planned, and then I said, I'll take the grave, please just send them on their way. To that last point, yes, I fully agree. I very much think that song foreshadowed the lore, and I think it's been kind of a key point of the idea that Clancy would die at the end, in a sense. I think the sort of death that we saw was him becoming Nico. And this also ties in to the Torchbearer's plan, right? The extended version of those lyrics, the fuller version is, then I saw him torch in hand. He laid it out what he had planned, and then I said, I'll take the grave, please just send them all my way. All right, this is the Torchbearer's plan that is first shown in the self-titled album from 2009, and then referenced and hinted at all throughout the letters. And so what exactly that plan is sort of up for interpretation, but we know the Torchbearer had a plan. Clancy agreed to it, but it wasn't really, it was a tragic plan, let's say. And so I'm of the opinion and the theory that the ending that we see in City Walls is what the Torchbearer planned. That doesn't mean he's happy about it. That's why he's sad and dismayed at the end. But this is what was necessary in order to finish laying out the groundwork for the final Clancy in the future to come and break the cycle. Which sort of goes against part of what you're saying here with the empty set symbol, the idea that there is no true solution, only trying again and growing. So I would be curious actually to hear more about how you think that the empty set symbol sort of relates to this. But I do like that idea, right? That the empty set symbol means there's no solution for the equation. It's a symbol which has been in our faces since Blurryface, and at the end, we don't really get a clean-cut ending, which is why there's so much speculation, which I lean into, that there's more to finally wrap up the story in the future. Not that they are going to give us more themselves. I don't think there's going to be an explicit ending. I think Dragpath just points us towards the fact that sometime in the future of Dema, that's going to happen. But they themselves are never going to lay that out for us clearly. But anyway, with that being said, thank you so much for this comment, Abby, and thank you to everyone else who left a comment for this episode. Once again, if you would like your own comment or question to be featured in one of these episodes, just leave a comment down below. Feel free to flag it as Perligo Ponders if you would like, but I don't just pull from those comments. And as always, thank you so much for watching or listening. If you enjoyed this, make sure to subscribe to the channel or follow on Spotify so you don't miss out on more music commentary and analysis.